honored and happy to have these four special people with us here today. And I'm just going to not say very much in my policy of not introducing anybody, which is I'm going to turn over to Rabab Abdulhadi, who's one of the people who spoke this morning and presented her research, and she's going to run this event. But she was part of the kind of original organizing of the day and a bit long symposium with me and Malik Abisab as part of the Women in War Stories project, together with the Teaching Palestine project. And there's a little more kind of info about that in the brochure, but I don't want to take time with it. And I'm just going to turn right over to Rabab to get started, and then we'll go.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Michelle and Malik for organizing this. This is really amazing opportunity. Sarah. Michelle. I want to thank Sarah for
thank you, Sarah.
Amazing amounts of work. And people behind the scene and the custodians and everyone else who actually made this happen. Secondly, I want to again acknowledge that we are meeting on indigenous unceded people's lands, and this is really important for us to keep in mind as we are discussing. Third is that this is going to be a panel about roundtable about Black and Puerto-Rican Solidarity with Palestine. And part of the reason we came up with this is as we commemorate the 1936th anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, we actually want to go back and not only talk about what happens over there, because we don't want to only grab our work in area studies. We want to contest area studies. We want to be able to think about all possibilities of how the world works, who works with each other, what's going on. And we also thought that it is not only about the scholarly aspect of it, but also about the real life. Things that happen in real life to people, just like the massacre and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, but also what was happening here in North America. And specifically, we're actually talking about the US, but we would appreciate people who may want to chime in with examples from Canada, things that happened. What happened in 1982, and 1982 was a very important period that actually changed a lot of things. And I'm just going to say a couple of things in terms of my own connection, and then I want to introduce the roundtable, my comrades, my sisters, people I love and have been working with for a very long time. And then they will speak for 10 minutes each, and then I have sent them a whole bunch of questions so that they will ask the questions. I'm going to be pressing with the questions because we're also trying to compile oral histories. And in order for us to be able to pass on the experiences of the elders to the younger people and have some kind of a continuity in organizing, that the knowledge that is the status quo does not provide with that. And it's actually designed specifically not to provide that kind of knowledge. So if we want to produce justice-centered knowledge, we really need to do this work ourselves and put it together and think about it critically and basically make sure that it's always imposed in the academy, it's always holding people accountable. So I said a couple of things this morning, but in 1981, the biggest demonstration in solidarity with Palestine was organized by something called November 29th Coalition. And November 29th is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, but it's also the anniversary of the United Nations partition of Palestine in 1947. But later on, the UN acknowledges at the international level. There was a huge demonstration that was organized in New York City at the United Nations, had 8,000 people. That was really at the time, in 1981. The coalition fell apart at that time, finished. But then, on June 6, 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. And as a result, people came together, and the coalition was revived and led by Palestinians and Lebanese. They were the leadership of this coalition, along with everybody, a whole lot of people that we can discuss with you, including the ambassador of Grenada to the United Nations at that time, actually signed and endorsed the coalition, the SWAPO, the ANC, PSC, African Caribbean Resource Center, people from all over. I mean, the list, there were over 100 organizations. They came together and they divided and they built, and I don't want to say what happened that summer because I'm sure my comrades are going to speak about some of that. And it was built throughout, and throughout the summer, this was continued. I was actually in Madison, Wisconsin, and organizing in Madison and Milwaukee. And then I moved to Europe after that and met a here, and we continue to work together since. But some of the people here have actually been organizing way before I came to the US in 1978. So they go way back in terms of the organizing. This is before people started taking up Palestine and organizing around it. And there was the censoring and the silencing and the McCarthyism then, as it is here today. So I'm really proud and I'm very honored to have the folks here today. So I'm going to introduce them, and they gave very official bios, so maybe I'll jump in a little bit, embarrass people. But I will begin to my left. Sam Anderson, he's a retired mathematics and Black history professor. He taught math, science, and Black history at various New York City metropolitan colleges and universities for more than 40 years. He is also the author of books on science, technology, and the history of slavery, like the Black Holocaust for beginners. He has been active in the civil rights Black liberation movement since 1964 as a member of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a founding member of the Black Panther Party. He has combined his activism with his scholastic work via numerous community-based organizations and Black Studies department. Sam is also one of the people who initiated the first statement of Black activists on Palestine that was published in the New York Times. And he was going to go to Palestine recently, and then the Israelis turned him back. 1970. And Sam, also, you were also the founder of the virtual Malcolm X Museum, I remember, and the effort to save the Schomburg Live ballroom where Malcolm X was assassinated. So there is, we keep going on with this, please. Rosemarie Mealy is a writer and educator who was an original member of the Black Panther Party as well. Professor Mealy has been honored for her community involvement on numerous occasions and was the recipient of the prestigious Claudia Jones Fellow. Claudia Jones, if you don't know who she is, there is a book written about her, To the Left of Karl Marx, because she's buried to the left of Karl Marx in London, but she is also, some of us believe, is to the left of Karl Marx. And she was honored as a Claudia Jones Fellow in the African New World Studies program at Florida International University. Mealy has lived and worked in Cuba, where she collaborated on several projects in support of U.S. political prisoners with Assata Shakur. She is also, if people don't know who Assata Shakur is, she is also an activist in the international human rights and political prisoner movement. Rosemarie was also the first UN representative of the National Alliance of Third World Journalists. She was a journalist at the Pacific station WBAI. She has also written the book, and she will speak about Fidel Castro and Malcolm X meeting in New York, and which was chosen last year to be one of 7 books that was going to be presented to Fidel Castro. He passed away before at the International Havana Book Fair. She has been involved in so many things, and we go way back around questions of Palestine, gender, liberation. Jaime Veve is a long-time political activist and retired trade union organizer. As a high school organizer for the Young Lords Party, a Puerto Rican grassroots organization that modeled itself after the Black Panther Party during the late 60s, Jaime built support for community control of schools in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, which was a very important battle. This crucial battle in a Black district of Brooklyn, New York, was a watershed event in defining the relationship between the Black and Brown community parents and students, and teachers on the other side. In 2012, he was a co-organizer of the US-Canada Joint Struggle delegation to the World Social Forum Free Palestine in Brazil. And he also participated and spoke on US workers' struggle in the international debt crisis held in Havana, Cuba in 1985. Jaime is a co-convener with Clara Storas and Michael Letwell of Labor for Palestine. And more recently, he has advised the leadership of the United Auto Worker Local 2865, which is 1,300 graduate students at the University of California, as they planned and successfully voted in favor of BDS in December 2014. And I should just, for disclosure purposes, Jaime is my partner. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sam, then Rosemarie, and Jaime to do opening statements. I've asked them, why did you become involved in Palestine? What happened? Has there been any backlash? What sort of solidarity activities were? So they will speak, and then we can pick up the questions. And then I'll stop. Eric, over to you, then we'll take it back.
Thank you, Rabab, and thank you everybody for coming out to hear us. It's very important as we age out of the planet to get our history documented in various forms, written and all. Rabab has given us a number of questions that would take maybe 3 hours to answer, so they're very important, but I'll be as brief as possible. The first question is that when did you become interested in Palestine and why? Please describe the circumstances. Well, I was about 23 years old in 1967, and I was a member of SNCC. By then, at 67, I was no longer a member of SNCC, but I was in the Black Panther Party. But I knew all the SNCC folk because I was a member of SNCC. So I went one day to 105th Avenue in New York City, which was the SNCC fundraising office, to have a conversation with Fran Beal, SNCC's most famous forthright feminist. And we were planning on doing something, maybe around the war in Vietnam or something like that. But we were in the office, and we get a phone call, and the phone call is from the landlord who had graciously given us the office gratis, you know, his support of the civil rights movement. And the landlord happened to be Jewish. And he said, I want you out by tomorrow. And what happened was SNCC came out with a statement in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle in the 1967 war. And when that happened, we lost the office and we lost tens of thousands of dollars in donation from across the country. That was my first introduction to Zionism, straight on. You have to understand that this was a very tumultuous time. Every day there was new levels of struggle in various parts of the country and world. We were doing all kinds of things. We were multitasking as young people, involving in the African Liberation Support movement, in the movement around what they call urban Negro removal, the urban renewal aspect, in the local level, voting problems and struggles in the South. So all of those things were coming together, and we were beginning to see ourselves as part of this global movement. And Palestine was one of the issues that folks struggled over within SNCC and other Black organizations, and felt that it was important for us to show our solidarity, at least by stating that we support their struggle for the right of self-determination. So that when that happened, it helped to speed up the collapse of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You lose that funding, you get terrible media coverage, or certainly no media coverage, and all of those things happen. The result was that most of us who were activists then in SNCC and in the Black Panther Party were resolute in standing with the Palestinian struggle. And so we moved on. 3 years later, I am at Sarah Lawrence College, heading up one of the first Black Studies programs on the East Coast. The Black Studies program at San Francisco State came into being, I think, in 1969 or so. In 1970, we had the Sarah Lawrence Black Studies program. And I'm in touch with a number of other activist Black intellectuals who are also joining in on creating these various Black Studies programs or departments, areas of studies all over the country. And one of my good comrade from the Northern Student Movement was Bill Strickland, and he was up at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And he called me one day and said that, you know, we really got to talk about and organize a statement of Black people supporting the Palestinian struggle since 1970. And so, you know, I said, yeah, you know, I'm down with that. We can do that. We have our network. We spread it out. We got a whole list of names to join us. We raised the money to put an ad in the New York Times, which was expensive, but not as ridiculous as it is now. And the ad ran. The next day in the Times, a letter from the president of Sarah Lawrence was published, stating that you know, Sarah Lawrence had nothing to do with this letter and so forth, and that they are in love with Israel and what have you. And that same day, I get called into the president's office, and this is being, you know, Sarah Lawrence is till today this liberal, wonderful place to be, joyful, and so forth. He calls me in the office and he says to me, you have done very good work here. I think the best thing for you to do now is just to come in once a week. He knew I was not going to take that, you know, because once a week meaning I was not going to get the same salary as a full-time professor. It would be once a week, right? Because I was teaching and running the Black Studies program. So I left there. But over time, in this period of the 1970s, I have and others in New York City area been engaged with members of the PLO in formal and informal ways. One time, I think this was now 1976, we organized a meeting of the PLO leadership, public meeting of the PLO leadership in Harlem at 145th Street and Compton Avenue, a little church, a little Black Lutheran church. The minister said, yes, you know, it's a good idea. We need to hear from the people. And he got the wrath of the media on him, the New York City police, the FBI, the Secret Service, everybody coming down and saying, you know, shut it down, don't let this happen. But he was strong enough, and we told him that we have his back, we support it, and it went on. But that was just another negative feather in my cap, vis-a-vis academia, in terms of thinking about teaching anywhere in the New York City area. But I was fortunate at the time to be at the college at State University of New York College at Old Westbury, where we also had an action in support of the Palestinian struggle. So my experiences were almost on an annual basis in this period in supporting the Palestinian struggle. Coming up to period which you mentioned, which I had completely forgotten, the 1989 aspect, where somehow I was supposed to go to Palestine, right?
Yeah.
And all the paperwork was in, yes?
Yes.
And I didn't. Huh? Yeah.
So the Palestine office, the mission, the United Nations mission of Palestine, said that they want to take some people to Palestine. So I nominated two people. I nominated Sam, because he has been doing it for a very long time. And actually, this was after we had the mayor of Nablus, Bassam al-Sheikh, visit, and you came and saw him at the Arab Community Center in Brooklyn. And so we nominated Sam because we thought this would be really good. He's been working for Palestine for a very long time. And we nominated another person named Ricardo Pons, who was the president of the student at the government at Hunter College, who had just passed a twinning agreement with Birzeit University. This was when Birset was born. And so both Sam and Ricardo went and got their passports ready. They had everything, they were ready to go. And then the PLO decided that they are not the kind of people that they wanted to take to Pakistan. So they canceled the trip. They canceled them.
Huh? Oh, well, yes. Fast forward to August 7th, 2018. I'm scheduled to go to Ramallah to do a presentation on social movements. It was an international conference on social movements taking place in Ramallah and also in Amman and the Jordan Valley. So I get to the Israeli checkpoint to get over the bridge to take you into Israel / Palestine. And I get stopped and interrogated for about 6.5 hours. And in the end, right when the last bus was going back to Jordan, they tell me that I'm banned because I'm a BDS supporter, and the new constitution allows us to do this. And so I was not able to get in. Meanwhile, I'm texting with my comrades in Ramallah, and initially they're saying, "Oh, this happens all the time," and I'm trying to tell them this is something different. This is they know who I am as a Black American. I'm coming by myself. I'm not part of a group, so it makes me an extremely easy target. And the result was that they had to Skype me in from the hotel in Ramallah. That experience is just a culmination of what I would see is like almost 50 years of doing anti-Zionist work and being a Black person in the U.S. It makes it very difficult for having any entry now in 2018 into Palestine, because you have to go through the Zionists, and they know who you are, right? They Google, they got the link with the CIA, FBI, and whatever, so they know who you are, and make that issue there. My time is up, right?
I'm gonna move on to Rosemary.
Well, first I'd like to thank Sarah and Michelle, that's in our link, and Rabab, also you, for constantly pulling me into these things when I have 1,000 other things. But it's wonderful always to be with students, young people. I love young people. I think that our story is important for you, and also my associate elders, of course. In answering the first question, I first became politically involved, but conscious about the Palestine causes as a result of my political involvement in the Black Liberation Movement. And this included, back in the early 70s, an organization called the Black Economic Development Conference. This was an organization that spearheaded our demands for Black reparations, because as people of African descent, in addition to the role of the banks and other commerce, our belief is that the Christian churches have a debt, because they benefited profoundly from the enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade. So the Black Economic Development Conference, I was the editor of their paper, the Black Manifesto. And there was actually a manifesto that was put out by activist James Foreman. And it really listed those demands of why we were making those demands of the Christian churches. And of course, we had discussions, obviously, about the struggles in Palestine. The next was my involvement in the Black Panther Party. And I mean, that was key and essential to raise the question of Palestine. And so that was a natural way of furthering my understanding and really becoming more conscious, more aware of what was going on in Palestine. The next organization was a group when I was expelled from the Black Panther Party because as a feminist, I challenged the leadership, and we won't go into that. I became a member of an organization called the National Alliance of Third World Women. And this was led again by the theoretician, the feminist theoretician that Sam mentioned. Her name is Frances Field. Our organization included Native American sisters from the Middle East, African American, Latino, and it was just an amazing organization because it thrust you in recognizing the centrality of gender oppression, but at the same time recognizing that we each carried with us our own special oppression. And those of you in gender studies, you have been taught that, and you understand theoretically what that means. So within the Alliance, we participated in demonstrations, the massive demonstrations in support of Palestine, and of course, meeting with women from the Middle East. Our understanding of that struggle became more organic and more natural for us. Then from there, during the 80s, within the United States, challenging the revisionism of the Communist Party, there was a movement that emerged called the New Left movement. And I was living in Philadelphia at that time, and I was a part of that formation, where, of course, the issue, again, of Palestine was on the front burner for us. And as a poet, I was trying to find some poetry that I wrote during that time, but I couldn't before I came here. And I presented a lot of, I was a cultural worker within the organization. So a lot of my poetry was actually presented in mass, when we would go out doing community work or in public forums. And so it just shows you, for me, film and poetry and art is so important in articulating who we are as people and our struggle. And I think last night's film represents that. And so within the Black liberation movement, we always include that whole piece about the role of art. And there was even the Black arts movement that I was a part of, and so was Sam, where central to that movement was taking our poetry, our dance, our music, our song into the streets. Another way of educating people and carrying forth the understanding of how we are, and in an international, the world is a global world, and we are just one part of that global world and one part of that global struggle. Then from there, I became a member of the Venceremos Brigade, which is an organization of North Americans, and there's even Cuban Solidarity groups in Canada that are part of the Canadian Cuban Solidarity work. In the Venceremos Brigade, we actually challenged the U.S. blockade against Cuba, and we would, for 50 years, we have been taking delegations of young men and women to Cuba to actually perform in some way, some symbolic ways of solidarity. And it was in Cuba where we also had an opportunity to work directly with brothers and sisters from Palestine. And that was just an incredible experience because you're cutting cane, you're planting trees, and you're working with these young people who are studying in Cuba and having conversations. And so you're getting direct information from them as well that you can then impart that information when you return to the United States. The next question was, what were some of the actions in which you participated or took upon yourself as a result? My firm belief is in organization and doing collective work. So a lot of what I may have done individually, I don't attribute to individual work, but it was a part of the collective experience. So in my own situation, during the early 80s and later in the 90s, I was a producer at Pacific at WBAI Radio. And we heard that name this morning from our speaker, where I produced radio programs. And in particular, I produced a program called the Alliance Report. And this was a weekly program where we did interviews with other journalists covering Palestine and the Middle East, including my dear friend Rabab, who I could always call upon at the last minute for interviews. The program made available segments of its monthly program to the Palestinian Solidarity Committee, as a matter of fact. So they had an entree directly into the airwaves at Pacific WBAI radio. As Rabab mentioned, the National Alliance of Third World Journalists, we obtained NGO credentials as an organization, and I was the first representative, which enabled me to have more access to the PLO and the UN office. The Alliance of Third World Journalists in 1982 was the first, and to our knowledge, the only group of African American journalists to conduct a fact-finding tour to Palestine. Our journey took us to Lebanon in August of '81, just after the horrific bombings of Sabra and Shatila refugee camp. And we also met at that time with Yasser Arafat, at a time when the Zionists, their lock on the media and information was at its height. When we returned home, we had community forums and sparked interest engagements that were linked to the ongoing work of the Black community around the links between the Palestinian struggle and the anti-apartheid movement. So all of our movements, you know, we always bring in, and it's a lot around what we've been talking about this morning about we have to really see injustices as a collective concept. And I think that's really an important thing that I think all three of us, four of us who's sitting up here, that we struggle within our organizations to embrace other movements. And sometimes not everybody wants to do that, but that's been a paramount thing that we've done. One thing I really want to say that what happened after our fact-finding tour to Lebanon, the organization experienced a backlash. Many of our members were blackballed, we were frozen out, and we were fired as journalists. And I just want to mention quickly, there is a sister whose name was Gwen McKinney, who was one of the founding members of the NATWJ. She suffered immensely from the Zionist assault on her, which was so ferocious that it caused her to leave Philadelphia, where she was working as a working journalist. The Philadelphia Tribune, and this is great irony, which was a Black newspaper, fired her, okay? And which resulted in mass protests when she was fired. How many of you ever heard of Mumia Abu-Jamal? Mumia Abu-Jamal is an African-American journalist who was, at the time, he led a mass demonstration in support of Gwen. So there was that interconnection. And this all just helped to illustrate the Zionist stranglehold on the media, including the Black press. But the story behind the story is that a year after the National Alliance of Third World Journalists fact-finding tour and debate around the U.S. involvement in the Middle East intensified, the editors of the Philadelphia Tribune came crawling back to Gwen and commissioned her to do a 3-part series on the struggles for Palestine. So, you know, sometimes things work in our favor. I have to stop here, but we'll integrate some of the other questions into the discussion. Well, sure. Okay. So between, as I mentioned before in my bio, I worked as a journalist, as an internationalist for Radio Havana, Cuba. And so the close ties between my work and the Palestinian Solidarity movement was always strong and supported. And so when my journalist experience took me into Cuba, it enabled me to be in direct contact with members of the PLO, again, and the Palestinian students who were studying on the island. And for most of them, I can remember, when they would meet me, this was their first encounter with an African American, much less an African American woman, who no less was living in Cuba in direct challenges to the anti-Cuban and hostile policies of the U.S. government. In 1990, moving forward, there was a forum sponsored by the Palestine Aid Society and the Palestine Democratic Youth Organization titled The Gulf Crisis, U.S. Policy and the Palestinian Question on the International Day of Solidarity with the People of Palestine at the Mark Ballroom, a huge ballroom in New York City. I appeared at that time on a panel with Ibrahim Abdulhadi, members of Palestine's National Council, and Professor of Political Science, also Ramsey Clark, who was the former U.S. Attorney General, Abdulhadi, who was at Middle East Studies, and also Michael Moore, who was the filmmaker who produced Roger and Me. Again, having that kind of thing and that kind of forum, the information, then we would then take that information and we would bring it back to little forums that we held in the neighborhood. If it was a housing struggle that we were involved in, we would always compare housing, what's going on in Palestine, compare that to housing in the most developed country in the world. And you do those kind of contrasts, and that's a great way of getting people to see that our struggles here being in the U.S. are like the struggles that were being engaged in Palestine. Sam and I both, as a final piece, Sam and I both were mentors to Palestinian poet Suhair Ahmad, whose work reached paramount audiences with her appearances on Broadway with the production of Deaf Poetry Jam. And the producer of that was African American. And although she had reached, she was pretty popular even by then, but they saw, as capitalist as he is, saw the potential of having this woman, a great poet, to appear in that way. Again, art was used to really expand what was happening in her country of birth.
Well, I'd like to thank also all the organizers, Michelle, Sarah, and Malik, and others who I don't remember their names. Thank you for the opportunity to come and participate and to present a little bit of our background and history. I want to preface anything specific by framing the fact that we are a product of a particular moment in US history, and actually in world history. And we were a product of the generation of the post-World War, decolonial era, the civil rights Black Power movement, which affected across the board, which helped to generate the Puerto Rican movement, the Mexican-American Chicano movement, the Asian movement, and in many ways we overlapped in support of the civil rights Black Power movement, and it helped to awaken our own political identity and struggle, and I'll explain that in a minute. And also we were a product of Vietnam War. It shaped and affected all of us in one way or another. In addressing the Vietnam War, whether through a Black African-American perspective, a Puerto Rican perspective, a white working class perspective, it brought into question the broad political question: why Vietnam? Who benefits from Vietnam? Who are the Vietnamese? Who are the allies of the Vietnamese? The question of the Soviet Union, the question of China, the question of the relationship between liberation movements. Vietnam also affected us personally. I was going to be a baseball player. I never had dreams of anything else. I was so much going to be a baseball player that I used to sweat baseball statistics. But then Vietnam loomed and destroyed that dream because I was drafted by the US military, as many of us did. I refused to serve. I refused to go in. And it basically destroyed my baseball perspective. But it created a different perspective for me, and that is becoming a political activist and organizer. It also, that period in which I became aware was when I was in high school. And in high school, in my neighborhood, in Brooklyn, New York, there was a very central battle over the question of school education, which in New York, as great as people think New York is, has one of the most segregated public school systems in all of the country up into today. It is one of the most segregated, and this battle has been going on way before the 1960s. too long to discuss. But in particular, there was a very significant struggle in which I was involved as a high school kid, and that was called the Ocean Hill-Brownsville struggle, in which the community created a school committee to run and to direct, and it led to a fundamental battle that was national in character. And the reason I raise it is because, unfortunately, the Black and Latino community, led by women, confronted the reality that most of our teachers, the majority of our teachers, happen to be Jewish, which was a product of, obviously, developments within the Jewish social framework. But the reality is that I never saw a Latino teacher up until I got to high school. And I only met my first African-American teacher when I got to high school. And I was never taught African-American history, Puerto Rican history, whatever. It was all about George Washington, . This was the battle. We decided that we want to be able to have curriculum that reflects our living experience. We also wanted teachers who reflected our living experience. Lo and behold, we came up against a bureaucratic political structure, which at that time was very dominated by a Jewish teacher's profession. And the struggle became twisted into the charge that the community, by advocating its own rights, was going against the Jewish community and thereby the anti-Semitic. So that's how I was introduced to this whole question. And as a product of it, I became aware that there was this question called the Middle East, the question of Palestine, the question of Israel, the question of Zionists, as a result of being in this contestation battle, because this whole question of anti-Semitism, the whole question of the Middle East came up. Subsequently, of course, as a result of my own political engagement after that, being a young activist and then becoming part of a young formation of Latino political activists, the Young Lords, Puerto-Rican Socialist Party, Comité, and others. Obviously, then I became much more aware of the broader question, started studying, reading, engaging with different formations of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Right? And also, when we created a Puerto Rican high school student organization, we engaged with student organizations, the Iranian Student Association, the Eritrean Student Association, and also Palestinian Student Association. So that was my introduction as a young anti-imperialist by this point, radical, anti-war, and decided that I was part of that generation, that we, in addressing our immediate struggles in the US, started connecting at that time on a global scale. We looked at Vietnam, we looked at China, as I said before. So that helped to shape my understanding. And since then, of course, I want to emphasize how, as many people today don't have an understanding that that Puerto Rico is a colony of the US, okay? A lot of our situation, we've heard about the hurricane disaster, this coming week will be a year. But Puerto Rico is a colony of the US. I did not know this history at all when I was growing up. And when we talked earlier in the panel about trauma, I wanted to show how this also transcends in other communities. In Puerto Rico, up until the formalized status of Puerto Rico as a US Commonwealth, it was an outright colony up until the 1950s. The Puerto Rican flag was prohibited, the language was English, identity with Puerto Rican pro-independence was suppressed. There was an absolutely vicious anti-McCarthyite period in Puerto Rico. People were literally killed, worse than even what happened in the US. So that for many years in the late 50s into the 60s, it was hushed. No one spoke about Puerto Rico independence movement. No one could mention the word the Nationalist Party. And the reason I say this is because when I became active, when I started becoming first the Ocean Hill-Brownsville, then supporting the Black Power movement, then the Puerto Rican independence movement, and then of course Vietnam, my mother became traumatized. She said, "Oh no, you're becoming a loco, you're getting crazy." And the reason it came out that in my family's history, my grandfather and my uncle had both been members of the Nationalist Party. I never knew this history, no knowledge of it. My uncle served 3 years in prison, in federal prison, in Miami, because he refused to serve in the US Army during the Korean War. I never knew this history. And this is part of that trauma that Malik and others were talking about, how you suppress. And I was a reflective of that. I didn't know anything about it. So my mother, all that trauma came out when I started becoming, radical. And there is the leap from a baseball player, fanatical baseball player, to what Chico was. I was becoming a fanatical radical. So this is how it came. I am a product of the generation of the 60s. We went from being anti-imperialists, becoming members of different particular groups. And then, of course, we have gone to continue our work at different levels, academy, trade unionism. I became a trade unionist. It was through trade unionism that I was able to avoid the draft. I did go into trade union, and within the trade union, I'm of the generation that had participated in United Fruit Workers, farm workers, civil rights movement, and we brought some of those skills and outlooks into the labor arena, which went against the tradition of the conservative U.S. trade union movement. We brought in the question of mass struggles, intersection, as we call it today, and in that process over the years, we have introduced the question of Palestine into the debates within the U.S. Labor Federation. Not as successfully as we wish. That is a real difficult dinosaur that we've been chipping away, but we have been doing it. I myself have introduced the resolutions on the BDS, introduced the resolution to withdraw U.S. labor ownership of Israeli bonds. So as a product, that is the way that I have tried to bring the question of Palestine and organize around U.S. labor and its relationship to U.S. support, U.S. labor support, AFL-CIO support for U.S. foreign policy.
Correct. Yeah, I know this. Okay, so I'm going to actually segue a little bit away from Palestine and go into more discussions about the Black Panther movements in that period, because I think some of the stuff would be quite useful to think about that moment there, that you were all involved. You were all involved in this organizing, not only in Palestine, but with your organization, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords Party, the Anti-Vietnam War. I mean, a whole bunch of organizations. And I should say part of also our connection is that the Teaching Palestine project, we're not only commemorating Palestinian anniversaries, but we're also marking the 50th anniversary of the 1968 moment, which was in history, happened in many places for us at our University of San Francisco State, which Sam mentioned was the strike, the longest actually student strike in the history of the United States. Students struck and demanded the creation of programs, academic programs, that reflect their lived realities and decolonizing the curriculum. And as a result, a year later, in 1969, the Black Studies department was formed, and also the College of Ethnic Studies was formed. We can talk about that if you are interested to know how did it go from the demands for third world studies by the actually led by the Black Panther Party and the Third World Liberation Front, to becoming ethnic studies. Very, very interesting. But majority of the people who actually formed that, the faculty were fired, were let go. The people who actually led the struggle were gotten out of it. So this is part of what we are trying to do, is to think about what happened 50 years later, where are we at now? What lessons do we draw from those periods, and what can we learn until today? So I want to ask you all, but I also wanted, kind of like maybe elaborate a little bit about the whole question of Washington Brownsville, too, because you already mentioned about the and I know you've told the story many times over, but discuss other things, that what exactly happened at that time, and who was involved, and how was it a struggle between, because not all the Jewish teachers were actually supporting against the community control, and what happened with the charges of anti-Semitism. And I think this is, if you can just elaborate on that just one moment, and then I Rosemarie and Sam had to speak about what was the power of being organizing something like the Black Panther Party. Where are we at now? How do we assess the struggle from there?
Wow, there's so many different facets. But first of all, as Rabab just correctly said, there was also a generational shift with the teachers. And in actuality, 70% of the new teachers who were Jewish supported the community across the picket line. The only picket line I would say that I ever crossed in my life. And that's because they actually were part of that period of identifying with the whole issue of community education, the community's right to have a say in the courses, in the curriculum, and many of the young white teachers who were, and many of them mostly Jewish, broke with the conservative political leadership. It was a leadership that was reflective at the time of the post-Cold War period, who were very conservative, anti-communist, anti-progressive, and in this case, the teachers union really became antagonistic to the question of Black nationalism, what they perceived as a threat to, as we would think in terms of the way Trump is manipulating today, that very same issue when it comes to Black Lives Matter. Okay, so at that time, thinking about 40, 50 years ago, this was and became a central contested issue in which the political forces became arrayed. And the progressive political forces in New York supported the community. At the same time, the conservative right-wing bureaucratic structures who felt their powers were being challenged. And in that time, the Board of Education, the actual institution that controlled the education system, and the union, the teachers union, which was a right-wing formation that had gotten rid of the radical previous, under McCarthyism, had gotten rid of the radical progressive teachers union, they actually co-managed the teaching system. So there was a mutual interest in their attempt to maintain the structure. So in the battle, for example, the teachers union, it became later, all of a sudden a leaflet appears, a very anti-Semitic leaflet, viciously anti-Semitic, and it was out of nowhere it came, and it was allegedly put out by the community board that was leading the community struggle. And it turns out subsequently that it had been manufactured by the teachers' leadership and distributed in order to discredit. Well, and the teacher's leader was Albert Shanker, who was supposed to have been a socialist in his early years. Produced this leaflet, mass distributed, and gave this view, a perception that the community was anti-Semitic in order to reinforce that and to galvanize the Jewish community.
And the media.
And the media, and all of the power brokers in New York against this community struggle of really self-determination. It was vicious, it was violent, and at the end of the day, they did destroy that initiative of community control and input. But they used it, and it was a very critical point of departure that today still exists. It broke the so-called liberal support for civil rights movement. It broke the so-called liberal Jewish alliance with the Black civil rights movement. It was one of the critical points that divided and reinforced and strengthened the Zionist political influence that in conjunction with the 67 war. This was sort of a critical departure from the traditional progressive role of the Jewish community in support of the civil rights movement. And it must be acknowledged that was very significant. This 67 war and the 68, 69, 70 battle for community control of schools was a critical departure in which anti-Semitism drove a wedge.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. in the Black Panther Party at that time, we supported the other community that was struggling for community control that was in Harlem, the IS-201 struggle. It's a school that was built in the community. Everybody hated it because it had no windows, but it was about control. And the Panther Party felt that as one of its first actions would be to lend support to community control, make sure people come out to the meetings and so on. What this means, what community control means is that, well, you mentioned it, parents and students work in collaboration with the teachers and the principal. They would set up a structure where the parents and students and teachers would hire the principal, would hire the teachers, would design the curriculum to be reflective of the community in which the school is, which is Black and Latino for the most part throughout the city of New York. And that the school board would be reflective of the parents and the culture of the community. And the New York City is made up of 250 neighborhoods, and the lifeblood, the essence of the city is based in those 250 neighborhoods. And many of the schools were centered around maybe at the most 4 or 5 neighborhoods coming together. So you see, there was a very close network in developing that the powers that be saw the power of the community having control over something that was so essential to the development of the capitalist system, and that is the education of the workers, no longer being in their hands. And they couldn't deal with that. The compromise was, because it was such a powerful movement, yes, we lost community control, but the compromise was decentralization. And in decentralization, parents did have a role to play within the board and the hiring of the superintendent of the board of the district and the hiring of principals. It had some teeth, but between the United Federation of Teachers and the overarching ruling class in the city of New York, they took 30 years to dismantle that, to take all of the things out and bring in all of the worst attributes of privatization, charter schools and what have you, into the system. And like Jaime said, the system is so uneven. I don't like to use the term segregation in reference to New York City, because New York City student population is 85% Black, Latino, Asian. So how can you integrate? You know, I mean, there's not enough white kids to go around. So it's an issue of distribution of the wealth or the money that's there. $27 billion a year. And how do you distribute that within the 1,100 schools, and who has the control, who makes those decisions? Right now, it's in the hand of the mayor, and that's a dictatorship. That's not democracy. They took the democratic process out. The school boards, in terms of bourgeois democracy, the school boards was your entry point into the democratic process. It didn't make any difference whether you were a citizen or not. You could vote for a member of the school board. That got you entree. School board members would be able to rise up within the electoral political scene and even run for mayor, like de Blasio. He was a school board member. Okay, he got involved in politics through that. So anyway, I don't want to go on with that. I just want to mention one other thing in terms of the counterintelligence program, which is the federal government's FBI's effort to destroy the Black Liberation Movement, destroy the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement, destroy the Chicano movement, destroy the Asian community, destroy, and the American Indian movement, exactly, destroy that. One of the things they did in 1968 was to do a grand sweep of young Black men across the country and to sweep them up and saying that you were evading the draft and begin to imprison you or force you into the draft. I was one of those young men that they picked up. I was exempt from being drafted because I was in a critical field. I'm a professor teaching at Queens College, teaching math. Math is a critical field during those times. They picked me up because of my political activity. When they picked me up, they sent out disinformation. They put in the local newspaper, the Daily News and New York Times, that they finally got the leader who was the liaison between the Soviet Union and China and the Black Panther Party. It was a fantastic disinformation thing. But fortunately, I had a very good landlord who happened to be a lawyer. And I didn't have to spend time. The other part was that there was a legal group called Rabinowitz and Bodine that did work through that period, and they supported me in 18 months. Was back to normal.
I just wanted to add, because the whole attack using anti-Semitism with Cuomo has come up again.
Yeah.
For another advocate of community control and more equal in the last Democratic primary.
Well, most of my involvement have been within national formations, not just New York, but across the U.S. So I really want to stress that, because in all of the work in the national formations that I was been involved in, we had to take into consideration the realities of those individual communities. Now, what may have been happening in New York around community-controlled schools, in another community in Chicago, it could be housing. And maybe later on in the years, the issue of community-controlled schools would come up. In San Francisco, another issue. So I think it's important. By the way, the Black Panther Party that Sam is talking about is not the same Black Panther Party that I'm talking about. And I think we need to clarify. Well, he can clarify that. It was a group of former SNCC members who initiated the first Black Panther Party out in New York, right? Yeah.
Comes out of Lowndes County, Alabama, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization that SNCC formed and created the Panther symbol in Alabama. And we picked it up in New York in the spring of 1966, formed the Panther Party, and then distilled the Malcolm X's 13-point program in the Organization Afro-American Unity. We distilled that down to a 10-point program. Passed that around the country to comrades around the country to support it and say, if you believe in these 10 points, you can form a chapter. And hence, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton were one of the groups. Their group was one.
And that became what most people know as the Black Panther Party. But so we're trying to clear up that history, and it's really been important for young people. One of the questions that I think that we need to address now in hindsight, as we think about what we've done or what we did, I really think we romanticize the revolutions.
Before you do that, can I just say one thing that I think romanticizes the revolution?
Yes.
Before you unromanticize, I think, because I think there are things that maybe people, also young people, do not know, is that one of the things that the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords did was the institution of the breakfast program. And that is, and it's, to me, it was the point came home when I was in South Africa a few weeks ago, and there was a big discussion in the newspaper about university students going to school and not being able to eat and needing to have breakfast and lunch, because if you don't eat, how are you going to be able to learn when you're very hungry? So I think this is one of the things that actually was really important, and that led to a lot of. So there is a lot of the stuff that happened then, and some of it is still with us. And also, I remember, Jaime, you were telling me too about the whole question of making the state pay for the people to go visit the prison. So that which people would not have been able to visit prisons. And for me, as a Palestinian, actually coming from Palestine and talking every time we meet with people, and people tell you how difficult it is to make visitations to prison because it's very far, it takes a lot of money, you have to take the whole day off, and then you may be taken back and so on. That in itself, being able to actually go visit your relatives in prison and give them support when they are lonely, when they are in prison and so on. So there are some of the things that I think are still with us, structural issues that have happened as a result of the struggle. Some of the stuff was,
No, I agree with you. I mean, there were programs of the Black Panther Party that the U.S. government co-opted. For example, the free breakfast program for children. The reason why Head Start, these are like free kindergarten programs for children in the States now, they have breakfast programs. So to co-opt something that's really political, the government used as an attempt to depoliticize the significance of those people-to-people programs, while at the same time it criminalized those of us who were members of the Young Lords Party and members of the Black Panther Party. So the free breakfast programs, the health clinics that we started, the testing for lead test poisoning,
garbage collection. Which
I mean,
resonates with Beirut.
Exactly.
The bail funds that were set up, the clothing programs, and these were not. We never perceived of anything that we did as charity. These were needs that people had, and so you had programs, and then what would happen is it would spearhead other communities to replicate those programs, and that was a very important educational piece. So I just wanted to add. Okay, so one of your questions asked, in hindsight, how do you assess the actions that we took, that we undertook? Well, we thought that the revolution was going to happen tomorrow, and so pick up the, our slogans, pick up the gun, the chants, and so we were, we were a lot of it had to do with what was going on with you all. You were a part of a national liberation struggle, and we were, quote unquote, in the U.S. we said we were struggling in the belly of the beast, right? I mean, that was a reality, and I think what that did, it did create a certain kind of romanticism, and in the creation of that romanticism, we underestimated the power of the state, right? And that's why they were able to infiltrate the movement with agents. There are parts on my body that no one could have seen, could have been that close to me, unless, like, I have a spot on I think it's like, I can probably see it myself, the second. In my FBI files, I'm identified by that. And there was an agent that I must have, I don't say I slept with him, maybe I didn't. There was an agent that I knew, someone knew, it could have been him or her, who knows, but they knew, and so they infiltrated the organization, and that infiltration contributed to the development of this incredible program that Sam is talking about that still exists, the COINTELPRO, or the counterintelligence program. The underestimation, I think, also resulted in our having more than 200 political prisoners currently languishing in U.S. jails. And they're not, they're like 80, 70, 80, they're old now, and they're gonna be there for life. But you know, across the country, people don't know about that, you know. So that's an important point, like languishing in your prisons, in your jails, right? They will never get out. I mean, there was one reason why I ended up going to law school, because, you know, I wanted to be a part of that movement of progressive lawyers who could work on behalf of political prisoners through the Center for Constitutional Rights, where I was initially an intern. So in hindsight, our actions, you know, we were brave, we were young, we had no fear of death, you know. I mean, we didn't. We were ready to accept death, you know, even as mothers, you know, like we sent our children away to stay with our parents because we never knew if we were going to get raided or not. Imagine waking up in a tank, an armored tank parked in front of your residence where we all are, you know, going to sleep at night behind sandbags, having your children, your 7 or 8, 5 or 6-year-old children leading the little ones to get into the bathtub because bullets deflect off of marble. I mean, that's what we were teaching. This is the USA. This is the United States of America, and we were at war, and the trauma of that war means at this point that some people just went crazy. You know, they committed suicide. And many, as I said before, and there are people who don't want to tell these stories. Huh?
Which year was that?
Oh, we're talking about the highlight of this is 1970, 71, 72, 73. Right. So then, and then we have, and the other thing that was important though was the international connection. The Black Panther Party had international status in Algiers. We had an office there. It was the international sector, and therefore in close contact with the PLO, the liberation movements.
Where they also met with Nelson Mandela.
Right. I mean, that's where I first learned about Al Fatah. I was asking Rabab. You know, you learn those things, and you knew that you supported it, but you really didn't know what it was. You know? So those are some of the kinds of things that Jaime is talking about, that we were a product of that period. And as women, the central role that we played in the leadership of that. Normally whenever people talk about the Black Panther Party now, we tell our stories, it's usually the men with the berets over the guns, you know, but women led that organization. We were in the forefront of that organization, and we had to struggle internally with the machismo, with the sexism. And so, in hindsight, we need to educate our young women who are engaged in becoming involved, that you are your own person, that you don't join a movement because of a man that you love, or you participate because you realize that it is in your own self-interest. And I think that in hindsight, that's something that we need to really stress among the young women that I do, the young women that I work with now, who want to engage in organizations like Take Back the Night or whatever the group is. The other piece too was the homophobia, that in hindsight, the homophobia that existed in our movements and still does to a large degree. But I have to say that it was in the Black Panther Party that we really, we struggled against that. And some of our strongest support were nationally, were women from the LGBT community. And many of them, some of them, served prison time for helping to liberate some of our brothers and sisters who were in prison.
I'm going to just mention a few things and then over to you. One, I wanted to just say, in terms of the solidarities, You mentioned prisoners, and when we did the first prisoner delegation to Palestine in 2016, one of the things that struck our comrade here in the US, but one of the things that struck them is that in Palestine, political prisoners are revered. And in Palestine, every university gives scholarships to Palestinian prisoners. I mean, there is something about close to godly status of prisoners. So prisoners, this is very important, sacrifice, and so on. The other thing that I wanted to say about, because majority of the people, a lot of people in the delegation, we had Han Jones, who was SFA, former Black Panther. Mumia Abu Jamal actually called from prison when we were writing in Palestine to wish people, the organizers, yes. And actually, a lot of the stuff is on video. We had people who were organizing with Mumia Jamal. We have Emily Douglas, who was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, and also the cartoonist, who was the editor of the newspaper, and so on. So there is a lot of connections that will actually continue. So when we talk about what happened in the 60s, this is not stuff that has happened and stopped. This is stuff that's continuous, and that's a very important actually chapter, very important aspect of things that we need to talk about, because it's not an idealistic thing where just people come together because they're all revolutionaries and they say kumbaya and everything is wonderful. Actually, this is serious struggle that people have struggled for a very long time. People have lost their jobs, have lost their lives, have continued to do that. So this is not something new. The other thing that I thought that was very interesting was actually thinking about Huey Newton's statement about homophobia, which is actually quite a strong one. And there's also the Young Lords Party came out with statement, which you can discuss. But I was thinking about a couple of other things that in the 60s that were somewhat addressed, but not really addressed, and some of the things that we need to take into the present. One is the question of Islamophobia. So I think for me, even thinking about Malcolm X and his speeches, one of the things Malcolm X says that when he speaks, they always say he's a Muslim. He used Muslim minister. They never actually talked about other ministers, but the Christian ministers. So there was this whole thing. So even the whole notion about people who were kidnapped from West Africa and brought to the US, in particular North America, as enslaved. They wrote on the walls of the cells Quranic verses to remember who they were, and that is something that actually gets this. And so it wasn't dealt with. It wasn't dealt with then. It continues. This is some of the things that actually I think it continues to confront us because of the way of the construction of Arab and Muslim communities, because of the construction of sort of like as if exceptionally homophobic, exceptionally sexist, and so on. So these are some of the things that I think continuous, and then the whole question of Zionism, then and now, and the question of Zionism in basically erroneously, really misusing the struggle against anti-Semitism in order to silence and basically stop any kind of activism around Palestine and so on. So these are some of the things that I'm going to put it out there and press it back on you. And you don't say that.
Well, I just wanted to, yes, as we look back at our generation, yes, there were many things, as typical of young people, we think we can do the impossible. And we did. We believed that we were going to make a revolution in a short period of time. And it was the period of revolution. It was a world phenomenon. 50 years ago, 68, Tet Offensive, student uprisings all over the world. They talk a lot about Columbia University, but this was a phenomenon that transcended the world. Tunisia, Morocco, Senegal, Mexico, worldwide, student young people challenging the social political structure. And we were proud of it. We were learning. At the same time we were fighting and struggling, we were grappling with theory and trying to understand the system. Some of us were able to develop it. A lot of us much later. Many of us didn't survive. But we're typical of what young people do. And it is young people who will make any social transformation or political revolution. Yeah. And many times when I look back at and read accounts of the political movements like Latin America, I'm amazed to think how young they were. The leaders of the political left in Chile, who tried to create a democratic revolution, the Cuban Revolution, they were all young. The African liberation movement, they were all young. And we were all a product of it. There were distortions politically, theoretically, from the point of view of China, the Soviet Union. Some of us adopted respective positions, some of us dogmatically so, which led us to blind alleys. But at the same time, many of the reforms that we pushed for, which were very radical. I remember I was one of the people that helped to organize and built alliances with progressive churches to build transportation from New York to the upstate prisons for the relatives. There was no system. There was no government. And today there is a system that is a product of it. The state took it over, co-opted it, but we consider that a victory. On the health issues, we consider that a victory. Many ideas, obviously the homophobia, sexism, male dominance, yeah, we struggled with it. Where many of us were really, we didn't fully overcome it. It is great that today there's a lot of work being done and a lot of publications about the women of the Black Panther Party. Iris Morales, who was a leader of the Young Lords, she just came out with a book about the women in the Young Lords, which is a very critical view, showing. I mean, a lot of us at that time, we didn't see it, especially us male figures. But even within there, we were coming up. I mean, you even issued a statement on the question of the gay struggle that was way advanced of anybody else that I remember at that time. And the Young Lords came out within the organization a very strong political advancement of the question of male chauvinism within the Latino culture, within the Latino struggle, which was an advance and much more advanced than had ever been addressed in the Puerto Rican struggle. So even though we weren't fully formed, and we think today that the generation today has a better understanding of the intersection of these struggles, we did help to promote it somewhat. Not fully, but I think we weren't totally ignorant of it, and we were able to help progress. I wanted to just, I just wanted to, before I forget, there was, and I think Sam alluded to it, it wasn't like we fully understood, or Rosemarie. Sometimes, we were so involved in the struggle, we supported, just automatically we supported the Eritrean struggle or the Iranian struggle. It didn't mean that we fully understood the struggle or we fully understood the complexity. The Eritrean, Ethiopian conflict, but we supported it automatically. And so that also was true with the Palestinians. It wasn't that we fully understood the complexity, the dynamics, the class, the social, the left, the right, but we supported the Palestinian struggle. It just was part of that period. We didn't even question it. Later, yes, today I look at things a little more deeply, look at things a little more critically. I have a little better understanding of certain particular struggles. Even Latin America, Cuba. Can't get anyone more 100% behind Cuba than me. But I still, today, I can look at it more critically, and I can see fault lines. At the same time, absolutely defend the Cuban Revolution as a product of a historical pattern. I wanted to just say that, just to show you, in Puerto Rico, its own particular struggle, because of its international context and struggle, we interacted. Are not fully understanding, as Rosemarie said, you meet at international conferences, the Palestinians, so you get those relationships. So for example, I just quickly want to say, before I forget, in 1985, the Puerto Rican independence movement activists in Puerto Rico were raided. And 13 political activists were rounded up, transported to the US, and tried for so-called sedition. In the course of their trial, the same thing occurred to a group of Palestinians in Los Angeles, which became the Los Angeles 8 case. The lawyer for the Puerto Rican activists was Leonard Weinglass, who was a very great one. And in the course of a rally event that we have in Puerto Rico, anti-Zionist political radical. In the course of a big rally we had for the Puerto Rico Hartford case, Leonard Weinglass, speaking, made an announcement that the Puerto Rican activists said to him, look, go and help the Palestinians. They need you more than us. And that was in a concrete material solidarity that sort of reflected that kind of relationship. Here they're on the gun, on the trial. But they said to him, go take on the case of the Los Angeles case. And just kind of, that was the kind of fluid interrelationship that sometimes we took for granted and we can't take for granted.
Okay, so I'm going to actually have Sam to speak, and then I'm going to open it all up to you. No, hold on a minute. Okay, I'm going to open it up to you, and I want when people are asking, if you can also say, when you're speaking, making questions, comments, what's next? So also don't, not only like an audience who sort of raises questions and in the best pattern of neoliberalism, consumers, but actually in an engaged, critical remarks to think about, so where do we go from here? What do we do about all of this stuff? What do we do about this stuff in terms of our intellectual work or our history? What do we do that in terms of our academic, curricular stuff? What do we do that in terms of our activism? And so I'm going to call on Sam, and I'm going to make up to you. Everybody can take 1 minute, and then we will come to the panelists.
I pass. I want to get.
Okay. I just want to say one of the, I'm always, you keep at, you ask us about now. I just want to raise this one question. In the advent of globalization and migration and the whole question of immigration, I think one of the challenges that we're faced with now, because at one time it was the Jewish merchants in the community. Then we had the Korean merchants. And a lot of the Black communities, the merchants that own the bodegas and the small shops are from in the U.S., from the Middle East. Right. Yes. And so the reference point that we are constantly having to struggle with in raising the issue of Palestine is how do we deal with that merchant who's running that bodega on the shop that's screwing the neighborhood. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, that's just some of the challenges that when we're organizing, that we're currently, and this is not just in New York, this is across the country. And because the settlement issues, the U.S. ICE deliberately settles people in different parts of the United States to break the organizing of those of us who were there first. So that's ICE is the Immigration and Naturalization Services. So like some parts of the South you'll find Vietnamese. In other pockets you'll find the Arab community. In others, so you really have to constantly be aware of what are the demographics in those places and throughout the country. Who are they using as a buffer against the struggles that we're
I'm going
waiting?
to open it up, but before I actually think that this is, I want to say something about this, because I think in every community there are people, immigrants in general, when they land, wherever they land, they always get herded into whatever the dominant status quo or hegemonic knowledge is.
Yeah.
They come to the US, they come to Canada, they get herded into whiteness. And this is the structure that they get incorporated in, because they think that this is the way, and a lot of people actually forget. And Michelle remembers there was, what was it, 1998 or something, the paper that I've given about whiteness, and then people were like yelling at me and all this, and then I stopped. I did not even mention it anymore. But I think also there is something that to be said, that if we want to kind of like, do the people who are the political organizers and the activists who actually see eye to eye, are they the ones who are supposed to be responsible for every single thing that other members of the community do? And I'm saying kind of like the whole question of do you hold the Black community for one? No, you don't. But I think we need to kind of figure out structures of analyzing what happens with immigration integration, analyzing what happens and why this is really important, not in a kumbaya kind of way, but in a real kind of struggle, people really coming together and educating and challenging each other. And the younger people, by the way, are I think they're much better. The younger generation are actually working on it. But I do think that there needs to be a lot of challenges to all these structures that are facing us today in order for us to stop these divisions. And I'm not sure if actually the divisions, because we always used to think that we have strategic alliances, and I'm not sure if the strategic alliances are actually really strategic or warranted, unless you really build them. So, okay. I'm gonna take hands. So raise your hand, say your name. Okay. Who else? Can I will take a start. Sama, Sarah, and then Khalid. Okay.
My name is Narrations. I'm the president of the Palestinian Foundation here in Quebec. The question I'm wondering about is that the first, in the beginning of your support to the Palestinian cause, you got to know it, I guess, through the PLO, going, meeting representatives from PLO. Maybe they were the symbol of resistance at that time during the 70s and so on. After that, with their development or degradation, I'm sure your perspective has changed, all of you, and the look for Palestinian resistance switched a little, especially that they have changed also their position, like the national authority banning you from going into Palestine, for example, at the West Bank. So how long did this take to switch? And was there a shock time, for example, in the middle that you this is not what we expect from the Palestinian resistance, of their direction, and so on. So that's.
I'm gonna take the question.
Okay,
Some
I actually have like so many questions, but I'm just gonna ask two. So the first one has
You know you get to ask more because you're sons.
I'll stick with the two, but the first one has to do with Rosemarie and like your talk, which was amazing. By the way, thank you for that. I really appreciated the gender analysis that you provided of a lot of the groups that you organized with. And I think it's something that a lot of us forget. That it also resonates like today and how student activists who organize around certain organizations have to deal with the certain gender aspect of it and the queer aspect of it that really like complicates and like take that into consideration. So thank you for like bringing that up. So my question is, you spoke about the romanticization of the revolution, which is something that I grapple with a lot, specifically in McGill in courses where we teach about these like very heavy books and content about like revolutions and war and whatnot, and then having to deal with a lot of like white students who romanticize that and render like death and war into something beautiful and something to be admired rather than something to be feared and something to respect but still to fear and not to like render it into this beautiful thing. But then I also believe in the use of art and poetry and filmmaking as a way to express identities and struggles and revolution. And so I was just wondering, since you also like express these two things, how do you reconcile the two of these things? Because I've had trouble, and I feel like they don't overlap in some ways, or like I'm scared of like erasing one or the other, since I do believe in both of these things. So that's my first question. My second question is, the talk really resonated to the present moment, I think, at McGill, and to both Jaime and Sam's analysis of your own work and your own activism, and not to be like to do the like analogy that like I think everyone like kind of finds is typical or whatnot, but McGill really does act like a state in which we kind of underestimate its power, and we, and they create this feeling that not only that the revolution is going to happen tomorrow, but that it's happening right now, particularly in their way, in the urgency of like what Jaime said of the course is not
really reflecting certain histories, not really reflecting certain identities. Particularly, like there is no Black studies at McGill. There's an African studies, but it's extremely underfunded, and the courses are underrepresented and whatnot. And so, and also the way in which McGill kind of get rid of the teachers and the students who stand up. So like what you were saying, Sam, about your own experience of as soon as you stand up, like in solidarity with Palestine, you're asked to come in once a week, and the way that I think resonates a lot with the present moment at McGill of like teachers who stand up either like for like Palestine or like other issues like gender violence, sexual violence, you know, all these like different things that resonate like a lot right now on campus are being like taken down one by one, and the way that we feel that. And so I was wondering if you guys could speak more about that. And then my 4 other questions.
Oh, wow, I don't know how to follow that up. I'm just like Sarah. I have many questions. I'm an older generation, so I'll ask the first one about, given your history. I was maybe just to ask the question in a different way. Recently, I was in Egypt, and in the post-Arab Spring and Arab Uprising, the youth are extremely disillusioned. Disillusioned is an understatement, really. We're talking about young people going into drugs, going to, a whole bunch of different ways. And this is throughout North Africa. I was in Morocco last summer, Egypt, and the aftermath of that is problematic. And one of the big central issues is the failure of the revolution, like you were talking about. They actually ask some of them, older people like myself, about how to go forward, and in fact, what to live for, given the euphoria that accompanied, and of course the setbacks, and then you have Yemen, Libya. So at this historical moment, it seems to me that the lessons that you were talking about how to deal with disillusionment, the failure of the revolution in quotation, what advice or how would you start thinking about that? And I know many of you have gone to the region. So you answered it in a particular way about looking at things in a nuanced way, but I was struck by what Rabab said recently that I always in turn knew, and that was the notion of a so-called Arab revolution, when there had been cumulative uprisings in the past that some of us participated in. So that was just a culmination, step towards that. And it seems surprising how it was even perceived by people. But my second question is the one I really want to ask. And that is to all of you, how have you dealt with the challenges within the African American community, of which I am a part, within the Arab community of which I am a part? And what I'm talking about specifically is dealing with, as my African American brothers and sisters always ask, is are Palestinians racists, are Arab racists? And also within the African American community, the divisions between those who are in solidarity with Palestine and those who are actually completely, not only not in solidarity, but actually have played a very important role in undermining and marginalizing those in our communities that are in support. And then for Rabab and perhaps also Haile, what has been the progress, if any, of that critical thinking within Palestinian activists? I know that in the 1970s and 80s, it was a real big problem, what I believe, because I'm Palestinian, and that is the kind of narrow-mindedness having to do with not understanding kind of how to link up with African Americans. How do we link up in a completely equal way, rather than just in a strategic way, if you know what I mean. Strategy is one thing, but how do we link up across communities, not just for strategic purposes, but really to understand this is a shared struggle, and it is really, how would you go about doing that? And have you seen that progress? I know that you are very center of that debate worldwide, because I've known you for a long time. So those are the two.
I'm going to take 2 more comments because wanna say something? No. And it's not like I'm just gonna want to ask in cultures. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah. Name?
Zaha. Thank you all for coming and giving that talk. I think just in the interest of time, my question kind of relates to what Sabra brought up, so I'm just going to request that when you answer the question, I just have something I want to add on. To me, the issue of romanticization of history is very important and very pertinent, but coming from like a younger person's generation perspective, I mean like a younger generation's perspective, what I see among people in my generation, or who I consider part of my generation, is that among those who know the history, like number one, among those who know the history, which is not a whole lot, there's a tendency to romanticize and to over-romanticize what happened and the stories of the past to the point where it renders it something like not even superficial because it's been romanticized, but something that is like not really important at all. You know, it's almost like irrelevant. Yeah, exactly. And something that is, yeah, just not, it's not pertinent to the times because we've moved on and this is something, yeah, that was something cool or cute or whatever, but you know, that's kind of how it seems to function in the minds of people my generation. So, and I think what also has played into that is in the current political climate, whether or not this is the case, whether or not this is true, I don't know about that, but what I think people nowadays are being told by the actions of certain people in power is that precedent is no longer a thing, is no longer relevant. You know, you have a Supreme Court in the United States who, though he may not be appointed a Supreme Court judge in the United States who may not be appointed anymore, was just saying, you know, that Roe v. Wade is not actual law. And so, I mean, when you hear things like that, when you hear people who hold power who are saying things like that and believe things like that and hold the power to change, you know, things that we grew up believing were human moments in history that changed the course of history, it makes you think like, well, was that something also superficial? So I guess just my question is, how do we keep the memory and the importance of these histories and these narratives alive in a way that is not preaching to the choir, you know, and in terms of like it trickling down into the minds of the younger generation. Yes, this is important, but it's not really happening. You know, it's not really happening. I don't think it's because there isn't an effort, but I think it's because, you know, for whatever reason, people in the younger generations don't think that it's important for them to know. So, you know, in your experience, according to what your experience has taught you, how do you make it something that's important to know? You know, so it's not just people who are searching for it and find it, but it becomes relevant in everybody's life.
Last question. I'm sorry.
My name is Mustafa, and my question's really, I mean, I guess along similar themes, but I guess the romanticization of the period, of that period, but more not about romanticizing it, but really, and people talking about sort of that world view, thinking about Palestine now, right? Where then Palestine wasn't a question of some kind of solidarity with you know, a group of people or even not a struggle, but that it was the question of Palestine was part of a broader moment of revolution, right? That there couldn't be Black liberation in the U.S. until there was Palestinian liberation, or the idea that there was, you know, that there was a worldwide sort of struggle in that Palestine, and the analysis of Palestine fit in that sort of in that context. And just the question really is about thinking about now, where the question of Palestine really is about rights, right? It's all about human rights or international law, and what has that actually done to reflect, because hearing the three of you talk, and what's been incredible is that, and maybe this is different in the US than here, so much of the strategical questions of Palestine solidarity now has been always the attempt to mainstream question of Palestine. So in the attempt to mainstream the question of Palestine and using sort of a rights discourse or discourse of international law attached to BDS doesn't become about liberation anymore. And so what flows from that was a whole bunch of maybe of mistakes or second guessing in which communities that the Palestinian question was anchored. Who are the strategic allies? Who do you work with? Who don't you work with? And so just really question on those thoughts in terms of the actual analysis and what that has meant then and now in your perspective.
Thank you all for no more questions. I'm going to give each person 2 minutes to respond specifically. So Rosemary, if you don't mind talking about the whole question of romanticization, and maybe you can address also the question that
Well, you know, it's really important that you know that we are grappling with those questions. You know, it's not just you, but we're grappling with those questions in terms of embryonic formations that we may be engaged in at this time, but just basically analyzing a lot of what we've been doing here, and I think that that's happening globally, you know. And so the question is, at what point then, with the advent of technology and things are, we were talking about today, things are so radically different today than they were during those periods that we're talking, you know. The role, you know, we have to have a clear analysis about the rise of the right-wing elements in this country, the anti-democratic movements, you know. So we need good global analytical analysis at this time. And emerging from that, it's not going to be, it may not be a formation clearly like some of the ones that we've been talking about here. And I think that these are the best kind of, you know, as you know, we just represent right now in this space a microcosm of what is happening all over the world, you know. And at what point then can our voices emerge that we're saying, oh, you're talking about that too, you're talking about that too. So I don't really have an answer, you know, and I'll be honest, you know, but I'm certainly not just sitting back wondering, you know, I'm engaging, I'm talking to, you know, women, you know, I mean, we're talking to groups of formations are being organized in places where the hurricane is just ran through South Carolina, you know. So even within the U.S., we're grappling with these questions, and I don't know, I can't, and young people, you know, how do you let young people know that they need to have hope, you know, the only place, even the only place where I talk to young people that have hope is in Cuba, you know, and even they're grappling with these questions, you know. But there are organizational forms where there are discussions going on in Cuba right now about the new constitution. Who would have ever thought about a new constitution under a socialist construct? You know, we thought that the one that was in place is great, you know, but it hasn't been great, you know. So I don't have any answers for you, seriously. But I'm just suggesting that you continue to engage and do exactly what you're doing. And it's true that a lot of our young, privileged, white youth, young people, they don't have a clue, because we have to talk about privilege. You know, that should be a part of all of the discussions. You know, I mean, with my students, it's about the impact of white skin privilege and how the students of color have internalized somehow that's a benefit that should just be, you know. And so you have to be honest and lay that out. And I really emphasize it's just what Che Guevara said, and I don't like to be cliche, that you know, solidarity is not about charity. You know, it's really about engaging and see that your issue or your struggle is really, it's interdependent. That's really what it is. And so on that, I don't have any pat answers. I just have suggestions, and I'm trying to put those in practice with the young people that I work with and that I have this kind of discourse.
That was an answer. Thank you.
There's so much to cover, so little time. But getting back to something that you had raised about the morphing of PLO, I see that as happening from, particularly in the U.S., from 76 to 88, from a revolutionary sounding, advocating organization to one that had submitted itself to the imperial rule. I think those of us in the U.S. who were following the evolution or devolution of the PLO understood that in this period. There was only, I guess, it'd be a minority of the left, if you will, in the U.S. because the left paints a broad picture of the Middle East, and it's just a broad, swath, no nuances or anything, and some of that has come about because of for example, the changes that happened from 76 to 88 within the African liberation movement, where ANC, SWAPO, Frelimo had seized power, and they become part of the neo-colonial state in their so that's the framework I think that when we started looking at and digging into the development of the Palestinian struggle and the organizations involved, I think that is what informed some of us, not all of us, but some of us. That whole aspect of once you seize power, or once you are getting near seizing power, what happens to your revolutionary spirit? Where does that go? Does it fold in on itself and disappear, or does it blossom in various forms? That is something that I think is important to look at, and I think that the leadership of PLO were not revolutionaries. I don't think they saw in leadership socialism, right? And all of the theoretical foundations of that dialectical materialism, it wasn't there, but might have been some of the elements, some of the methods. But overall, overarching, the revolutionary spirit was this broad spirit, and then when the devil is in the details, right? You start to question those things, and when those opportunities arose for some of the Palestinian forces to side with imperialism, they sided with imperialism. I have just a number of other things. Racism in the Arab community and the Arab community in the United States. The Arab community cannot be racist in the United States because they don't have power. They can have tons of prejudicial issues and policies, but they can't be racist. I think that what happened in terms of the Arab community in the United States was 9/11. 9/11, 2001. After that, the day after, many of the forces, people in the Arab community began to see that they were some variation of nigger. Okay, we tried to talk to people prior to 9/11, but that is what that's how white America, the power, sees you. But once that happened after that, because you know Aisha Al-Adawiyya, right? Aisha Al-Adawiyya, African American Muslim sister, and I, we went to a community, an Arab community, where they wanted to discuss what's happening. Why are we? And it was young people and not so young people in the meeting, and you know, I just laid it out to them that way. It was cognitive dissonance because they thought that they were part of the American pie. They really thought that deep down inside, and they didn't realize that until 9/11. And so that is that's still impacting, I think, in the Arab community in the U.S. This whole issue. And now today, one of the good things that's happening is that you know you have Muslim folk running for electoral office on the local level and beating in the primaries. Now, if they get into office, it's a victory. But I think that is a very, very positive move for them to be engaged in this period in electoral politics, coming out, you know, talking about what they stand for in a diverse community, right? And it's a breakthrough, and I think they need our support. Our meaning the radical forces in the United States need, you know, to support those who are progressive running. I don't think there's any Arab running in the Republican Party, but that may happen next year. But
There's
you know,
the Somali woman in Minnesota.
Huh?
The Somali woman in Minnesota.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes, I forgot. Yeah.
No, she's not Republican.
No.
You're talking about Republicans.
Oh no. Oops. Yes. No. She's not.
And if they are, then I.
No.
But they have been Republican. So
Well, they used to vote
there's been a
Republican.
few.
Yeah.
But there would have been a time when you would not have even
No.
considered.
And especially women.
Right.
You know, Muslim women running for office.
The Palestinian Day gave one. So that's
But I just wanted to quickly. I think that
When I go back to Egypt and Sudan or Morocco, what can I say? Help me.
well, first of all, I mean, the bottom line is that the dominant ideas we know of the ruling class in this country is what filters down to the rest of society on a global scale. So most people outside the country, once they land here, they've come with certain conceptions and ideas about race and how they want to fit into it, well, no matter where they come. And it can be as black as black can be. And I know my biggest argument with the Dominican Republic brothers and sisters is that they don't identify as black.
They don't.
They will negate it 100%.
Not all, but
And,
yes. Yeah.
well, you know, I mean, in general,
That's right.
that thought of thinking prevails. Very closely connected to the Dominicans, argued with them, would argue with, you know, and where do these ideas come from? And I think it gets also transmitted and carried over by people from other parts of the world. It's, as W.B. Du Bois said, the 20th century is defined by the color, the question of color and race. How do we address it? How do we resolve it? Obviously, it's a contention between subsequent struggles and generations. Definitely, I think that this newer generation of younger Arab, Palestinians, have a better understanding, and those of them who were raised and have interacted with the struggle here, as within the belly of this system, have a better understanding than the generation before that came from outside. I think there's a factor there. So I think, for example, the Palestinian youth who went to support the Standing Rock, that's a very significant. That's not to say that previous generations didn't try to make those things. I know that was true. It's always been an issue, a combat, a struggle. Anyway, and the bottom line is, look, we have to look, as always, and that's rhetorical, I guess. I don't mean to be rhetorical, but obviously we always got to remember that struggle is never linear. And we do go through defeats and we go through changes, but those links continue. Like the Communist Party was crushed in this country. The idea of communism was crushed. The incredible weight of the Communist Party, which we still feel the effects of it. We need a mass political party in this country that is able to impact. And I believe the question of how do we carry struggle, one of the biggest weaknesses in the political framework today is we don't have a political party that can really galvanize on a mass level. And the Communist Party at one point, no matter what we think about its theoretical and weaknesses, nevertheless, at one point, it had an incredible significance. I remember when I first started becoming political, amazed at how many layers of people they had across the board who didn't necessarily identify as Communist Party, but worked with the Communist Party in different levels, in different mass organizations. We don't have that. And that's one of the weaknesses. In terms of the Palestinians, I think that Oslo destroyed much of those links. Because again, the role of the political parties in not only organizing, developing theory, but also carrying on the legacy, the traditions of organizations, so that today we're reinventing this new generation. The young generation today is trying to reinvent, struggling with the question of how do we lead a struggle and in what form? I mean, this whole debate about hierarchy, anarchism, at a distorted, in my view, a distorted concept of anarchism. But the whole question of organization, which we thought was a certain model back then, and now we realize that model necessarily wasn't absolutely correct, but still I believe we do need organization. Without organization, there is no way we can sustain a struggle. But that organization, that's for the young generation to develop within the framework of today. We, at one time, believed that armed struggle was it. Now we realize that as important as it was, as necessary as it was, and I would still uphold that view. Nevertheless, it wasn't sufficient enough and capable of doing what we needed to do. That doesn't mean that today we're going to advocate that. There's other forms of struggle, other forms of education. And again, it's really mostly critically important, knowledge and education, obviously. But organization, absolutely. What form? I don't know. I'm debating it myself.
To be very quick. I think that Mustafa and Khalid and Zahra, I think a lot of the questions are very similar to each other. Also, Noura, one is I think that there is some trends that are going on in Palestine that about human rights and rights and so on and so forth. But I think it's really important to think about also where is the origin and where are the things that are going on, who's formulating what. There is a trend in Palestine, of course, the leadership, and they never seize power because they didn't have power to seize. Palestinian authorities actually, it's so far from what happened with the free limo or swap or days. I wish we would have something like that. But that's the problem, it's like illusion. So I think there is that. There are the people who are out to lunch, and there are the people who are actually struggling day in and day out. And I think that was also for the Arab youth, because I follow the stuff about disillusionment, but I also follow the strikes that are going on in Morocco, day in and day out, about political prisoners, about the food, in Egypt, look at all the stuff they're passing, death sentences left and right, and people are still struggling. I mean, people don't stop. I think we really need to kind of like look at what's going on in different places. And I actually choose to look at where are the resistance that's going on, where are the potential that is challenging the hegemonic knowledge, the hegemonic status quo, the powers that and so on, and the powers that we are quite strong. We don't only, and I don't agree, by the way, it's the problem with the country, it's only the current line. I do believe in the indivisibility of justice. I do not think it's just race. I do not think, yes, I love Abdulhadi, but I do believe that it is multiple things that if we just drop the whole question of capitalism and neoliberalism and political economy and only talk about race, I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough to only talk about gender and sexual justice. I don't think it's enough to talk about environmental justice. I think if we do not apply a perspective of the indivisibility of justice, of thinking about things that are really, it's about justice and about all our struggles, not about only what works as consumer sort of like marketing rights-based approach or whatever. I don't think that would work. I mean, it could work for a short period of time, but it really doesn't work on the long term unless we really recognize that everybody's struggle is legitimate struggle, and everybody's struggle is not more important than others. And it's true, we cannot just say what's more important, the struggle against racism or the struggle for gender equality. How could you even say that? I mean, how could you say that for not only for people who within their bodies, they embody all these perspectives. I'm not even talking about that. Not about everybody, because even when people say, oh, I'm not a woman, it doesn't affect me. Yes, it does affect you because you benefit from it. Okay, it does affect you. One word, I am not a black person, it doesn't affect. Yes, you benefit from white supremacy. You need to recognize that. So I think it's really important for us to have this perspective and to also look for all the people who are resisting. We wouldn't be here. I want to remind people, if you think that I'm overly idealistic and I'm overly optimistic, we wouldn't be here if there weren't people struggling day in and day out that make the work that we do relevant. I mean, we would not be here. We would not be here to discuss things if there is nothing to discuss. We would not be here to talk about refugees if people are not protesting every single week at the border and people are every single day saying we're going to defy Oslo, despite what Trump and everybody else says. I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind. And I think it's really important for us to draw the lessons of history, to think about what happened, where did we go wrong, what are the things that we can learn, what sort of organizations work, what sort of organizations do not work, what sort of structures work and don't work. I think this is, I'm very hopeful. I would not, I'm 63 years old, 63 years old. I'm 63 years old, 63 years old, I keep forgetting. I don't know, like, I'm 63 years old. I wouldn't be here struggling day in and day out and being sued and also continue, because if I didn't believe in it, I'm not doing it for vanity. I really believe that at one point people will succeed. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I will see the little changes. I will see it in the eye of the student when the bulb goes on. I mean, that's, I see it when we all sit together and we need to leave, and I know Michelle wants us to leave, so we can, you know.
Can I just share something?
Go ahead.
You know, what happened for us, particularly during the 60s, one of the major struggles that we had in our own community was people telling us, why are you all worried about what's going on over there? But we have to deal with here. And we broke through that, you know, to show how what was happening over there, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, had an impact on us. And also the struggle against narrow nationalism. That was a real challenge for us, you know, and it's still existing in the community, but at least we have a worldview and a global perspective that transcends that now. And young people, I believe, embrace that.
And there's a reason, and there's a reason why Martin Luther King's speech on Vietnam is never really mentioned.
Right.
So, with that note, I first want to thank the organizers. I want to thank everybody who made this possible. I want to thank Michelle and Malik for their amazing project. I want to thank Sarah.
Yeah.
I want to thank Katie. I want to thank everybody. Zaytoon up there. I want to thank, oh my God, Tamim. And all the volunteering that you do. Every single person here, and my co-panelists and everybody else who made this possible. All of you who stayed until here.
Well, we want to thank all of you. Is that permitted?
Yes.
All of you.
I see my
Oh, I should turn that off. Thank you so much. So glad to have you.
It looks like you were the A1, Yani.